Salutations, fellow Depthians. We will be performing a brief overview of From the Depths and its various features, such as the main campaign, its objectives, factions, and enemy difficulty, as well as the designer, covering the basics of armor, weapons, and hull design. The main focus of the game is the creation of various vehicles out of blocks that range from submarines to spacecraft that engage in combat with one another until one of them is completely destroyed. However, the game is not limited to the creation of simple vessels of destruction, as one can create purely aesthetic works, such as replicas of historical ships. The only thing that limits what you can build is your CPU and your patience. From the Depths has a considerable amount of content and challenges spread between the different planets and missions. We will only be discussing the two most interesting parts of the game, the main campaign and the designer. Despite this, you will probably spend most of your time within the designer, testing your various creations against the enemies found within the main campaign. It is here within the designer where the true difficulty of the game is revealed. First, one must make a functional craft, then make it cost-effective, and then finally optimize it and make it look nice. Starting off with the campaign, it is set on a planet called Neater, which has 8 main factions fighting for control of the planet. The primary objective of the game is to secure world peace regardless of the cost. The most common way of accomplishing this goal is by engaging in mass genocide, and while there are diplomatic resolutions to the game, this method is by far the most entertaining. To succeed at this goal, one must first capture a resource zone to begin the manufacturing process of your machines of war. Once a sizable force has been amassed, the destruction of the enemy fortifications is the top priority as they produce enemy vehicles. Destroying all enemy fortifications of a faction causes capitulation and subsequent deletion of all of their remaining forces. Within the campaign there are 8 factions that you fight, each one with their own unique design, color schemes, and gimmick craft. Of course, not all factions were made equal, and some are objectively harder to beat than others. Starting off the faction list with the worst of them all is the Deepwater Guard. They are shitty pirates, and the ships that they use are mostly wooden cannon fodder, created from scraps and duct tape. As such, they serve as excellent opponents for beginners, as well as testing weapon systems. Following close behind would be the Onyx Watch. They are essentially sea dwarves that have floating castles and large, slow cannons. They are easily taken out by EMP-based weapons, and are likely to be the second enemy one encounters in the campaign. Next up is the Lightning Hoods, a very annoying faction with fast vessels and energy weapons, mainly lasers, can be very difficult to deal with but are hard countered by smoke dispensers. One of the harder factions to deal with in the game as they can be very evasive and effective from very far away. The White Flayers are masochists. Most of their craft found in this faction rely on ramming mechanics, which is not very effective when the main staple of the game is ranged naval warfare. Needless to say, this faction is probably the second easiest faction behind the Deepwater Guard. The Twin Guard is if ChatGPT was able to produce Gundams. They usually have very high repair speeds, but are gimmicky as you can snipe one portion of most crafts to land an instant kill or at the very least, cripple them. The Steel Striders, objectively one of the harder factions in the game, with some of the most realistic looking craft, along with some absolute monsters like the Tyr and Megalodon, which make extensive use of several defensive techniques. They are definitely a late game faction as even some of their easier designs are well made. They tend to make use of planes and submarines. The Grey Talons, a group of flying tribespeople. Most of the vehicles that they utilize are front-sider-based thruster craft, which can be very annoying and difficult to deal with for players. They make extensive use of missile spam and can easily overwhelm or tank active defense systems. Some of these designs are simply very annoying to deal with, such as the Goshawk. The Scarlet Dawn, aliens invading from another planet. As such, they have some of the most well-designed crafts, mainly their hovercrafts. Other than that, this faction is pure bullshit that borders on cheese mechanics, such as orbital satellites, teleportation, and lasers. The overall difficulty of the game is broken up into 4 main categories. The harder the category, the larger, stronger, and generally more expensive the craft become. Starting with the easy category, most of the craft have light weaponry and pose little threat. Normal and hard enemies tend to have weapons that are capable of beating poorly designed craft, as well as some stronger defenses. Most hard craft have active defense systems as well. Godly craft are the best designed vehicles in the game that take advantage of several advanced building techniques and min-max both their defensive and offensive capabilities. Continuing with the designer, which is where most of your game time will be spent creating and refining craft in order to beat the other factions in the campaign, or just to simply build whatever you like. From the Depths contains several features such as Lua code. There are several ways to create functional craft, all with their own unique strengths and weaknesses. The most important thing before you create a craft is to ask questions. For example, does one want a boat, a thruster craft, perhaps a plane? Does it need to fight, transport materials, scout? Should it be expensive or cheap? One might also want to consider the aesthetics of the craft. Generally, constructing the hull first is effective for producing affordable and aesthetically pleasing craft, while building systems such as weapons and engines first tend to produce more effective but expensive craft. To gather ideas and develop building techniques, it is suggested that one spawns in a high difficulty enemy, or use a reference image. Moving on to some building techniques, we are going to cover some defensive strategies first, then move on to weaponry. Starting with armor layering and armor class. Simply layering armor improves its survivability and overall effective health because the armor behind the outer layer increases the total armor of the block in front of it. And as damage is calculated, it will decrease the overall damage taken by the block. For example, AP over the value of 72 will deal full damage to all blocks, and AP over this value is wasted. Wedge spam. Very simple to implement and increases the survivability of your craft greatly and extends the ideas of armor layering as the damage is further reduced based on the angle of impact. Placing wedges of varying length between your outer hull and vital systems like ammunition and the AI mainframe is the most common use of this technique. It is often combined with the placement of heavy armor to improve the armor class of the wedge and overall effective health. Bulkheads are another way to vastly improve the durability and survivability of a vehicle, as it ensures redundancy and prevents your ship from sinking from a single hole. The subsequent air gaps also act to reduce explosive damage and select armor-piercing damage. LAMs. Laser anti-munition systems, more commonly referred to as LAMs, is used as an active defense system that requires a laser to operate. Despite this, it is reasonably easy to set up and provides very effective defense, making one's craft practically immune to all but the largest of missiles and cannons. Moving on to weapon systems, there are 5 main weapons that are at your disposal in From the Depths. Cram, missiles, advanced cannons, lasers, and plasma. Each one of the weapons has its own strengths and weaknesses. Starting off with Cram. Very large cannons, they deal vast amounts of damage but are slow and easily countered by LAMs and CWIS unless a large volley is fired. It is one of the cheapest weapon systems and is a good starter weapon to learn as it introduces the idea of weapon Tetris. Missiles. Easy to set up, fire and forget weapon system. Generally good for beginner craft but are countered by pretty much everything and can be very ammo inefficient. They can also be used in a more of a utility role, such as flares and buoys. Advanced cannons. A jack-of-all-trades general-purpose weapon system that can adapt to most situations. However, it has a steep learning curve and can be very time-consuming to set up and optimize. Lasers. An expensive weapon system that takes up a lot of linear volume, but essentially has infinite range and near-perfect accuracy. As such, lasers are well suited for dealing with small, nimble craft. Plasma, a newer weapon system added to the game. It is essentially a laser combined with an advanced cannon hybrid that ignores armor class and can deal large amounts of burst damage. The downside of this is it's very expensive to make and maintain as it needs both ammunition and energy, but can be very space efficient. It is highly recommended to check out the Steam workshop of this game as there are many very talented individuals constantly producing works of art and technical marvels. That concludes this brief overview of From the Depths.